Hi there, it's Tracy Kiernan from stepbysteppainting.net, and this acrylic painting tutorial is going to show you how to paint this snowy mountainscape. So I'm going to show you techniques for painting snow-capped mountains and a lot of other basic landscape painting techniques. I'm going to go over the brushes that I used for this painting. So I used a fan brush, and this fan brush is about an inch wide, and I used that just for the pine tree. I used a 3/4 inch flat wash brush, a 12 bright brush, a number 4 round brush, and there's only 4 colors for this painting. In fact, you can even eliminate one of the blues and make it a 3-color painting. So I used titanium white, cerulean blue, and Mars black, and there's only a teeny bit of ultramarine blue in there, and I used that for some of the darker parts of the mountains. So you will definitely appreciate the simplified color palette in this painting. We're going to go ahead and get started. So my canvas is in a vertical direction, and I'm first going to define where the horizon line in this painting. Almost all landscape paintings have a horizon line. That's where the base of our mountain is going to be and where our water kind of meets that part. So measure up about 6 inches from the bottom, and then make little tick marks and draw a light horizontal line with a straight edge across the canvas. You can also use a T-square for that. And if you're using a different size canvas, you'll want to adjust that. It's a little less than the halfway point of the middle of the canvas. Go ahead and load your palette with cerulean blue and titanium white, and use your 3/4 wash brush. We want to load the brush in the water and kind of tap it dry. And we want to mix about equal parts of the blue and white together. It's going to lighten that blue. And I'm going to do the sky in diagonal strokes just to give some interest in the painting. If you want to not do diagonal, you can do horizontal. But what we're going to do to create contrast in our mountains, we are actually going to have our sky be dark at the top and light towards the bottom. If you look at the finished version of this, the mountains take up over half of the sky. But right now we are going to fill up almost all of the sky area. So I did kind of a first row with just the blue, and this second row I'm doing with diagonal strokes and blending on the canvas. I added more white to my brush, and I'm going back over that diagonally, and I'm letting that kind of blend up into that darker blue. So my goal here, we're not going to get a perfect gradient because we're doing diagonal strokes, but my goal is to have the sky be dark at the top and light in the middle and towards the bottom. So I'm doing diagonal. So as I keep working my way down, I'm adding more white to my brush and letting that blend. So more white to the tip of the brush, blend it in with the rest of the sky. And because there's still that blue on my brush, I'm going to get darker streaks in there, but that's okay. That's what wet on wet blending is. I don't want to over blend, because if I just kept working this paint, it may all just kind of mesh together and become the same color. I want that variation of color in there. It makes for some interesting different colors to look at in the sky versus if it was just solid the same color. So I want to just keep adding more of that brighter white as I work my way down. This is going to create that kind of glow in the sky behind the mountains, and it's going to create some really pretty contrast. It's going to allow those mountains to stand out really nicely. I'm just going to go back and kind of blend this in with the rest of the sky. So you want to keep doing that wet on wet blending. You don't need to have your strokes completely smoothed out, so we can see some diagonal strokes obviously in the sky, and I'm not going to keep working it to where they're completely blended out, because then the paint will just all blend together. But right here, just going back very gently with that brush to kind of blend that darker blue down. But again, it doesn't have to be a perfect gradient. So when you're done with your sky, we don't need to wait for this to dry. If it is soaking wet, you might want to let it dry a little bit. Mine is not soaking wet at this point. It's drying kind of fast for me right now. But again, if this color blends with what we're going to do, that's okay. What we're going to do, without rinsing the brush, we're just going to grab that blue, that darker blue. So I grabbed that blue right there on the tip of the brush. And I'm going to use the tip of the brush to draw my mountain peaks. So I started on the left, and this mountain peak, the highest part of that peak is about the halfway point of the sky area. So these mountains are relatively high. This peak over here is our highest peak. It's going up about an inch higher than that first one. And then I'm going to do the other few peaks that are about the same height as the first one. So again, you want to make sure that you're taking up about half the canvas. And all I did was I used the tip of the brush to draw my mountain peaks in. If you wanted to do this with a piece of white chalk, you can. You just want to make sure your sky is dry if you're drawing this with chalk. But chalk is definitely, it helps you be a little bit more confident with how you want your placement of your mountains. So now that we have our mountains drawn in with paint, we can paint them in. So for this first layer, we're going to do these mountains in layers. With this first layer, I am just using that blue, that darker blue, to fill it in. And yeah, there's still a little bit of white on my brush. We may have to go ahead and wipe or just completely rinse off because we need this to be darker than the sky. We don't need that lighter color to blend in. So we can wipe our brush off if needed. I'm going to load my palette with some more of that Cerulean Blue. Basically, we just need to fill in everything from our mountain line to the horizon line with this darker blue. And it doesn't really matter the direction of our paint stroke. So I am kind of following the rule of if I'm on the left side of the peak, I'm painting diagonally down to the left, and if I'm on the right side of the peak, I'm painting diagonally down to the right. We will do more of that in a later step. So like for here, you see how I switched the direction of the angle, and then when I get to the bottom, it's kind of more flat. So we just want to fill in all of our mountain. It also doesn't matter which mountain peak is in front of which one right now. You can kind of define that with how you're painting your strokes. So like right here, I could decide that that one's in front just by painting over that, but we can always switch that later. So our main goal is just to fill up the shape and cover all that white canvas, get this first layer of paint applied, and make sure the edges of your mountains are nice and defined. And then as we get to the bottom, I am actually going to add more white to my brush because the base of these mountains are lighter. Kind of gives it the effect that there's some fog or mist at the very base of the mountain. But also there's some lower mountains in this painting. If you look at the final picture, there's some smaller mountains that are overlapping this larger one. So by making this bottom part lighter, we can add some darker color to define more mountain peaks. So more white, and then without rinsing, grabbing that white, and I'm just going to go in and fill this bottom area with that lighter color. I'm doing horizontal strokes left and right, and then blending it up. So that's going to allow the bottom part of our mountain to be lighter and blend it up. So now we have the basic first layer of our mountain. Let's go in and define our lower level mountains. So I have two more peaks that are overlapping, our larger ones that are in the back. And I'm going to go ahead and wipe my brush off and then load it in just the blue this time. So this should be darker and provide enough contrast to see. So just blue on the tip of the brush. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to define that shape. By using the tip of the brush, I'm going to draw in another peak. So this one is in front, a little triangle shape, and we have, let's do another kind of low lying one over here. And then we can go in and fill those in with some of that darker color. This part of our painting is still relatively wet, so we're not going to be able to get too dark here, but just enough extra blue to let that stand out. And you can see the effect that it created by letting that color in the back be lighter on the bottom. So it helped to create some contrast so that these peaks will stand out. And that is our first layer of our mountains. Before we can add any more detail work such as snow, we need to let this dry. We can go ahead and apply our first layer of water. So everything below, besides our two land peninsula areas, is going to be water. And we used the same color for the water. We can go ahead and we can use the 3/4 flat brush to create the water. And I'm going to load my brush in some white and that's the blue, so blue and white. So kind of the same color of the sky. We want to just kind of test it out. So we want we're going to let this be lighter than the mountains so it stands out. And we're also going to do left and right horizontal strokes. That also helps to tell us it's water instead of mountain, because we're not going diagonal right now, we're going horizontal. But I want this to be a lot lighter, especially right there at the base of the mountain, so that it can stand out and let us know that it's water. So I want to do left and right strokes using the white and the blue, and I'm just very loosely letting that blue and white blend together, but not all the way. So letting some of those blue streaks kind of show up in my white paint strokes. It's going to already create some lines in that water. So we're going to go down all the way. So don't worry about where your land is going to be. Those will be painted black in a later step, and those will have to paint over all this water. But right now we just want to cover our canvas. So get all those white spots of the canvas covered up. I'm using a lot of white for this step. If you want your water to be a little bit darker, you can. But the reason why I chose it to be super light is so that it would stand out against the mountains, because we're using the same colors. We're not really changing colors here. So we want to create contrast by making it lighter. And then we can add a teeny bit extra blue in there. So I'm just loading my brush with just the blue and just gently doing horizontal strokes in the water, creating some water ripple effect with that darker blue that gently blends with our white. So that's our first layer of water. We can go in and detail this later, but right now we've got all our canvas covered, so we can go along and add more things to our landscape. We really need our mountains to be dry for this next step. So if they are not dry by now, either take a break or dry it real quick. So I dried mine with a blow dryer, and I'm going to be using a number 4 round brush to do the detail work in the mountains. I'm going to go ahead and load my brush in the water and pinch it to get those bristles all collected right there to create a point, and load it in just the titanium white. So I am going to go ahead and divide each of the mountain peaks in half. This is going to help create the 3D look in the mountains. So on each of the peaks, we're going to start at the top where the tip is, and we're going to go down and make a very squiggly line, a very, very loose squiggly line that goes down, and then it goes sharply to the left. So right here, I started at the very top, very loose squiggly line, goes down and to the left, and it just stops, like when it gets to the area of the peak to the left, it just stops and sort of just disappears. This one, again, it stopped and sort of, it actually hit the edge of that peak. This one too. And then this one. And then right here we have one that's kind of going off the canvas, but we'll kind of do the same thing. It just kind of stops. So we allowed our mountain peaks to be divided, And this is going to help us decide where our brighter snowy part is showing and where our shadowy part is showing. So we're going to have our snowy part be on the right part. There's snow on the left parts too. If you look at the finished version, there are white areas on the left, but it's brighter on the right side. So we're going to go in with our round brush and we're going to do thick layers. So I'm applying this relatively thick and I'm kind of dragging my brush and I want to go in a diagonal direction to the right, but I'm not trying to cover up all of that blue. So I'm dragging that very lightly. My brush is kind of skidding the canvas. So if I press hard right here, you see I'm pressing hard at first, it's brighter and whiter. But then as I kind of go down, I'm kind of letting go of the pressure to the point where it's almost dry brushing the paint. Like right here, the paint kind of runs out on purpose. So the snow is brighter closest to that line, that edge right there. And then I'm letting my paint kind of run out and kind of fade away. So I'm not covering all of the right part. I'm just adding little blotches of texture. Right here, as I go kind of down, it kind of just kind of fades away down here to the lower part of the mountain. So I'm doing this to the right side of each of my mountain peaks. So starting with our white, lots of pressure at first, bright white, and then you kind of hold your brush at an angle and use more of the sides of the bristles. That helps get that lighter white in there. So at first I'm kind of using mostly the tip of the brush, and then as I go down I'm using the brush more at an angle and using more of the sides of the bristles. That creates that thinner stroke. So little blotches of texture. And we can go ahead and do this to this mountain peak as well. Bright white at the very top. It kind of skids and gets sort of lighter and kind of fades away towards the bottom. Again, you want to make sure you're going down at an angle. So this right here, going diagonally down. Right here, when we kind of define the edge, we can just kind of blotch it. So see angles. We have a random bright blotch of paint, and that's okay. Here, angling downwards. So we can apply this concept even further. And on the left side of our mountains, we have darker color. So I used my Ultramarine Blue to get an even darker version of this blue. You can even go without using Ultramarine Blue in this. You can just use the first blue, the Cerulean Blue, but I wanted to add some even darker blotches in here. So we're not going to do a lot of this, but just a few little darker shadowy areas on the left side of the mountain. I'm going to do the exact same thing, the little blotches. Try not to go over that division line, but just add little blotches of shadowy texture strokes on the left side of your mountain. This right here helped me define that peak overlapping the peak to the left just by letting that darker part overlap. So very, very almost dry brush style, because we don't want this to be too dark. Right here, kind of the same thing. We're letting that kind of swoop down almost in like a diagonal direction. So it, in a way, kind of overlaps part of that peak. And then this guy right here, get some darker splotches. I'm holding my brush more on the angle to use the full bristles instead of just the tip. And then there is snow on the left part. It's just more shadowy, but we can go in and add some of that white on the left But we want to be really careful with this step because we don't want to lose that contrast we already created. So we want to add just a few little white splotches, but not that much. We still want the right part of the mountain to be super bright. In fact, you can even skip this step. You don't have to add white blotches on the left part, but I wanted to do that anyway. So just a few white splotches kind of here and there. It might even blend with your darker blue a little bit. I then went in and with the white redefined that division line. So like right here, I want to make sure that's bright and white. If you don't like that effect, if it's too sharp looking, you don't have to do this step. Just going in back on my division line to make sure that division part is bright and white, helps make it stand out as well. Next, we are going to paint our two land areas with black. So I'm going to rinse my brush off and load my palette with Mars black. So take my black, load that with the black. I did end up mixing a little bit of blue in the black. So if you want to mix a little bit of blue in the black to make it more of like a really, really dark blue, you can do that, but it doesn't have to be that way. So I just took my brush and defined a little peninsula area on the right. The peninsula goes just a little bit above the horizon line, and the point, the far left part of it goes to about the midway point. So it goes about halfway across the lake, across the canvas. And our bottom land area is a low-lying land area that goes a little bit further than half the way on the right, but it doesn't go all the way across. If you wanted it to go all the way across, you're welcome to do that. So just using the tip of the brush to define your land, and then you want to go ahead and fill it in. So as I'm filling mine in, I'm actually adding some of that ultramarine blue to my brush to make it kind of a bluish black. That's an optional step. You don't have to do that. You can just paint it solid black. I wanted to incorporate a little bit of the blue from the landscape into the black. And we're just going to go ahead and fill both of those in solid. If you need to add a little bit of water to your brush to help get that to flow, it makes it fill in a little bit faster if you do that. But both of those areas are solid. Don't worry about the direction of the stroke or shading or texture or anything like that. Just fill it in solid. And this is still that number 4 round brush. There's another land area, and that is at the base of the mountain. So where our lake kind of meets the shore back here. We're going to do kind of the same thing, but what I'm doing is I'm kind of watering down a blackish blue, and I want this to be a little bit lighter than our land mass, but it's way in the distance, so it can be very abstract and not really defined. I'm actually going to load some more of this cerulean blue, and it's kind of a blue and black mixture, very loose and thinned down. I'm going to take that and go across that horizontal area. It's not a perfectly straight line, it's kind of wobbly, and it goes pretty much across that horizon area. It can go over the lake and over the mountain a little bit. This is our land, and we're going to paint trees on that land as well. So it would be very tedious to paint individual tiny pine trees across that land area. So instead of doing individual trees, I'm going to do little individual lines. So I'm going to take my round brush, and I'm going to make each line start from the bottom and stroke upwards. If you want, you can try to make your stroke a little bit thick at first and quickly release your pressure. That's going to allow your little stroke to almost look like a pine tree. So if it's thick at the bottom and thin at the top, it kind of creates that conical shape. So you're just doing a little bit of a variety of these. So some are a little bit taller, some are a little bit shorter, some are thicker, some are thinner. You're creating the illusion that there's a tree line going all the way across the lake, slightly overlapping our mountains. And you're doing this with the same color combination, so that blue and the black. You can vary it. You can even add a little bit of white in there if you want, but just be very careful if you're adding white. You might create, you want this to be a lot darker than our mountains. So if we added white, it may not help with the contrast. So using just black is safe enough here. So you're just doing all the way across, vertical lines. You're really only using the tip of the brush. That's how you create that thinner line at the top. You're using a little bit of pressure at first and then releasing the pressure and using just the very, very tip of the bristles to create that thin point. Adding a little bit of water to the brush sometimes helps. And also twisting your brush helps distribute that paint and get those bristles to go to more of a point. Going back over this and creating some higher trees. So we have a variety of tree heights. Then if we want, we can even add some branches to these trees. Maybe they're closer. So I'm just doing kind of a higher line and then stroking down little angled strokes to create the actual pine trees. You don't have to do this step. It's enough just to do the little lines across. But if you want to add more detail, so maybe these trees over here are a lot closer or a lot taller, but we're adding actual branches. So vertical line, branches, and I'm using a combination of the black and the blues. We'll do one more big one right here. So we're done with our tree line, and we are actually going to do some reflection work next. So we have our trees that are reflecting in the water, and we want to use a flat brush for this. So this is a 12 bright brush. It's a flat brush that's about 1/2 inch wide. And we want to do this dry brush style. So that means we're loading it into the paint. So I'm going to load it in the black and blue combination. And I'm going to use the little towel to wipe off the brush. We only want a very, very small amount of paint on the brush to where if we paint it, it's going to allow it to be very thin, dry, and translucent. We don't want this to be solid at all. We want to create the illusion that the trees are reflecting in the water without taking away from the color, too much of the color of the water. So I'm just using the full width of the brush and I'm stroking downwards from the very bottom of the tree line down into the water. I'm letting it just kind of fade away. It's kind of darker at first and then it kind of fades away. So to do that, you want to put more pressure on the brush at first and quickly release the pressure so that it gets lighter and lifts off. So press and lift off, press and lift off, press and lift. Be careful behind your peninsula. We do have the reflection, but we don't want to mess with our land and smear it if it's still wet. And we still want enough contrast to make it look like there's water behind there. So press and lift off. Just going back over some of these, making them a little bit darker, but we don't want them to get too dark. We still want to see a lot of that color, the original color of the water. I'm going to go in and add just a few darker strokes into the rest of the lake. I'm going to go ahead and rinse this black off of my brush so that I'm not putting black strokes in the lake. I'm going to rinse and tap it dry on the side of the jar. Grab some cerulean blue, some white, and just kind of generally all over, very, very loosely, left and right, adding some darker colors into the water without over painting it. So trying not to over paint it, but leaving a lot of that white still showing through. It's like the second layer of our lake. Gets it to be a teeny bit darker. I did it mostly in the middle area, but the loose left and right strokes kind of creates that water texture. Next, I'm going to paint the sun in the sky. So I'm going to use the number 4 round brush and titanium white, so just the white. Upper right area, paint a little tiny circle. I'm going to take my finger and I'm going to smear this to create the glow around the circle. So it's going to make it look blurry. So on the edges of it, it's glowing, and then I'm going to go back and do it again. Take my finger and smear it. That creates that glowy circle color, sun color. And I'm going to go in and do another little circle inside. So it's super bright on the inside and it's glowing on the outside. So there's our sun. And then in the water, we can just find a spot where it may be reflecting in the water. So painting it, taking our finger and just kind of smearing this. So pretty much the same thing, but it's reflecting in the water. I'm going to then go back and add some white paint strokes into the water, some more reflection water lines. And I can do this with the round brush, but it might be easier. So we're going to do it especially over our reflections. So make sure your reflections are dry. It should dry super fast because we did this dry brush style. But if it's not dry, you don't want to smear your black paint into these water lines. So I just used that 12 bright brush, the titanium white, and you want to go in and add little tiny lines that are in the distance. So the lines that are closest to the horizon line are a lot smaller and closer together. The lines that are towards the bottom are longer, more spread apart. And you're just using the tip of the brush to paint the little white reflection water lines, and especially over some of the tree reflection. And that's kind of the point. We want it to overlap to make it look like it's reflection in the water. We are going to do our large branch tree that's on the left side of the painting, and we're going to use number 4 round brush and Mars Black for this. So if you don't feel comfortable just painting this in, you are welcome to draw this with a piece of chalk or a pencil first and then fill it in. I'm going to go ahead and start painting it in. So I like to start at the bottom. Some people like to start at the top of the smaller branches. That's okay too, but I'm going to start at the bottom and define the base of my trunk. It's a larger shape trunk, and then my tree is going to kind of twist to the right and then kind of sway to the left, and it's going to get thinner as we go up. So thick base, thin bottom. So you just kind of define the edges and then fill it in solid black. So we're going to work our way all the way to the top here. So on the edges, I'm kind of making the edges a little bit wobbly. So I take that. So this is our first branch. When you do branches, you want to just use the tip of the brush. Press very, very lightly. So up here, this one's going to branch up. This one is going to branch, kind of curve downwards. So it's almost like I'm sketching with a pencil. So if this was a pencil and I'm sketching something, I'm holding that pencil lightly and just barely letting the lead kind of graze the paper for sketching. Kind of the same way with the paintbrush. These little thin branches are sketch-like branches. So we really want to hold the brush very lightly and use just the tip of the brush. Branches are a little bit thicker at the base, so we apply more pressure at first. By more pressure, I mean that we're pressing harder on the bristles. So for this guy right here, we want a branch kind of going out. So I'm going to press hard at first. So hard. Let loose to a sketch-like. So you're holding it lightly and just barely letting that tip of the brush kind of graze the canvas to create the thinner stroke. It helps to add a little bit of water to your black, and it helps to kind of twist your brush when you're loading it. Make sure your paint is going right on the tip of the bristles, because that's what we're using, is mostly the tip of that brush. If you feel the 4 round brush is a little bit too thick for this, you are welcome to switch to a smaller brush, or even a brush that you feel most comfortable with when you're doing branch trees. You can use an angle brush or a flat brush. You can even use a black paint pen for some of these smaller branches. It gives you more control. So I'm really going in and just kind of letting some of these branches have thinner lines, dividing them up further and making sure the base of the main branches are thicker. This tree is not going to have leaves on it, so the focus really is on the branches and the direction of the branches. Then I'm going to add some highlights. So if the highlight part is a little bit too intimidating, you don't have to do the highlight. But on the right side, I'm doing kind of a birch style, even though this wasn't intended to be a birch tree, I'm kind of doing it that way. So I'm loading my brush in the white without rinsing it. I grab the white and doing little horizontal kind of curved strokes on the right side of the tree, kind of dragging it towards the middle. So going from the right, dragging it towards the middle of that. So it's a little bit lighter just on the right part, and then dark on the left. Little tiny strokes. Gives it just a pop of color. Just want to be careful in this area because we already have a lot of white in that mounted. We don't want to lose our branches by painting too much white. Just a little pop of white, mostly on the larger regions of the branches. The tiny branches don't really need the highlight. That would be way too tedious to add the highlight in those areas. And then I'll do a little pop of white on this branch as well. Next, I'm going to add some grass texture, so it adds more interest to the bottom of the painting with the same color, but I'm adding a little bit of white in there as well to kind of lighten it up. So this is kind of the same technique that we did with the trees, only we're letting these little pieces be longer and kind of sway and curve like little pieces of grass. So I'm just starting at the bottom, using just the tip of the brush, pressure at first and quickly releasing the pressure so that the grass blade kind of curves or goes straight. I'm letting them curve one direction and curve the opposite direction, and then some grass blades are going straight up. So that creates a little bit of texture towards the bottom. And next we are going to work on our fan brush tree. So I'm going to go ahead and rinse my brush off, set it to the side, and get my fan brush. We're going to go ahead and practice this on a sheet of paper first. I'm going to actually grab a sheet of watercolor paper to practice on. And so the fan brush that I like to use is actually 1 inch wide. I find that the smaller fan brushes are easier to control than the larger fan brushes. So if you can find one that is also about 1 inch wide, I get a lot of questions about what kind of fan brush I use, and a lot of frustrations I find is if you use a fan brush that's too wide, or even one where the bristles are too soft. I find the really big ones have like super soft bristles and can't really control that. I think if you're working on a much larger canvas, the larger fan brush would make sense, but I like the smaller 1 inch wide one. This happens to be a Royal and Langnickel fan brush that I got at Joann. The exact listing is gone. This was bought 3 years ago. So, but if you can find one that is about 1 inch wide, that should be helpful for this. So with these fan brush trees, we're going to go ahead and do a vertical line. So if you just take your round brush and a ruler and just paint a vertical line. So if you're practicing this with me, do like a large vertical line kind of in the middle of the paper. Then rinse your round brush, set it to the side. Load your fan brush in the water, kind of tap it dry. And you want to load that paint on it. So I load it by kind of just stroking the palette, but you want to make sure that there's enough paint on the tips of it, and you want to make sure your bristles are all spread out, that it's not all clumped together, so it should still look like the original shape of the fan brush when you have the paint loaded. Start at the top and hold your brush at an angle. We can't create big branches at first because this is the top, so we have to use the side, the corners of that first. So I'm just tapping little tiny, stamping little tiny branches at the top. And when our tree, we're going to have our branches kind of flare out upwards this time around. So as I'm going down, stamping it, I'm moving in the left and right direction, stamping the brush, and I'm letting the branches kind of curve upwards. So they're swaying left and right, tapping the brush, and they are kind of pointing upwards. Going right, left. As we work our way down, we are pressing much harder on that brush, applying more pressure on it, using the full width of the brush. And we get down, and our tree is a lot bushier as we go down, so we need to likely load our brush in more paint as we go down. This obviously comes with a lot of practice. When I first started painting fan brush trees, I was frustrated too. Mine did not look like this. Sometimes I'll paint trees and they still don't look like this. So if you're frustrated, that is okay. Practice, practice, practice. You will get the hang of it. That's all I can say. It takes a lot of practice, but that's kind of the steps that I do for these trees. If I'm going to do another layer like snow or highlighting, I'll let this dry a little bit, then I'll go back. So this is white, and I'm doing the same exact thing. I'm going back over what I did with the white. Could even add some blue in there as well, so that creates color. So you always want to start out with your darkest color and then work your way up to your lighter highlight colors. So if you wanted to make a green tree, you would add lighter green colors in there. But our painting demonstration is more like a silhouette tree with a little bit of snow on it. So when you're done practicing, we can do the real thing. So we can go ahead and get our painting back. We're going to do the same exact steps. We're going to start with our vertical line and use the round brush to create the vertical line so we get the height of the tree in. So I'm going to take my ruler and decide where I want the center part of my tree to be. So if I put it far to the right, my tree is going to be hanging off the edge of the canvas, which is okay. But if we want it to be more central on the land, we can move our line over more towards the left. So I'm going to take it, put it more this way. And the height of this tree goes well above the mountains, not as high as the highest peak, but maybe just a little bit lower than the highest peak. But it's got to go above the mountains. It's a fairly large tree. And then we can get our fan brush, load that into the paint, and again we want to start at the top. We want to use just the corner of the brush at first and just stamp little tiny branches way at the top. So little branches. We're not using the full width at all. We just created little tiny branches, and then as we work our way down, we're using more of the full width of that brush, moving in a left and right direction, and our branches are kind of curving upwards. We're tapping it left and right, making those edges of the branches kind of perk upwards, and getting all the way down to our land area where it just kind of disappears at the bottom. And then I did one layer. If you wanted to make it more of a bushier tree, you're welcome to, but I'm going to do a reflection in the water. So I'm going to do kind of the same thing, only a little bit looser So instead of using the round brush, you could use the round brush for that line, but I just used the fan brush. But I'm basically creating a mirror image of what I just created, but I'm not making it super dark and I'm not making it super detailed. I'm doing the same thing. It helps to turn your canvas upside down so that you can create another tree, but just make it upside down. So there's a reflection of that tree in the water. Go back in, add another layer in there, but you can make it a little bit more detailed if you wanted it to. I decided my sun needed to move, so in a later step I will paint over that and recreate the sun so it's a little bit lower. I'm going to add another layer to my tree with the white. So this needs to dry a little, but it doesn't have to dry all the way. But we do need to rinse all that black off the brush. So rinse, dry, and titanium white. So we're going to load it in that white. So brush it on the canvas to load it. Get that paint right there on the tip. It ended up turning a little bit gray, but that's okay. So my intent is actually just to add highlight and not necessarily snow. It could be snow. So same thing, same exact technique, only we're not covering all of the black. We're going back over with the white layer, but it's not as much as the black. You can do the same thing in the reflection. So that adds more depth color into your tree by adding that lighter layer into it, but definitely don't want to cover all that black. And I took my fan brush, kind of added texture in this area. Kind of a creative touch you can do. It's optional, but I'm just kind of brushing that with a fan brush, creating some lighter color in that peninsula area. Then I am going to set my fan brush aside and grab my round brush here. I'm going to add a little bit of black water lines just under the peninsula area, so a little bit of a reflection from the land, but not too overwhelming, just a few little horizontal black lines in that area. And then I want to go ahead and fix the location of my sun. So super easy fix. You don't have to do this if you're okay with where your sun is, but if you're not, it's the beauty of acrylics is we can always paint over. So I just grabbed the cerulean blue, the white, just going back over that. Should be a super easy fix. And then I could take my finger and just decide that I want my sun down here instead. So it's more of a actual reflection of where the location of that sun is. There's no more major steps in this painting. Really, it's just a few touch-ups. So I went in with some more water lines. So right here, you just want to make sure your reflection of the tree is dry, but I went in with the white and did little horizontal lines kind of going over that black part of the tree to create some reflection illusion. And it's just a few more white lines here and there. I also added a few touch-ups to the mountains. Just be really careful not to touch up your mountain too much, especially like you don't want to kind of mess it up. If you're not happy with the way your mountains look, I would recommend kind of taking a break and then coming back to it later and looking at it because you don't want to add too much to it. But I just went in and just added a few more white kind of diagonal lines using the flat brush this time into the mountain area. So some diagonal lines going downwards to the right. And then I also added a few more branches to the tree. So using the round brush and just went in and added a few more thinner branches up there. Because there's no leaves on this tree, we can add more interest by adding some more detailed, fine, tiny branches. So very, very tiny branches. And this is the conclusion of how to paint a snowy mountainscape painting. Lots of different techniques for landscape painting in this tutorial. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to sign my name in the lower right part of the painting. Thanks for watching, and thanks for painting with me.